Good afternoon. I'm Kate Sears-Patowski, Programming Director for Expo Chicago, and thank you all for joining this conversation as a part of Alternate Assembly, Environmental Impact in the Era of Pandemic, a digital 3-day symposium featuring leading curators, artists, and scholars addressing how ideas in contemporary art can contribute to rethinking our natural and constructed environments. This afternoon's program, Desert as Place and Idea, Planning Desert X 2021, is presented in partnership with Desert X, produced by the Desert Biennial, a 501c3 charitable organization conceived to produce recurring international contemporary art exhibitions that activate desert locations through site-specific installations by acclaimed international artists, as well as our media partner, ArtNet. Desert X has invited its 2021 curator, César García-Alvarez, and artistic director, Neville Wakefield, to speak with artists Xaviera, Simmons, and Stringfellow. Xaviera's sweeping body of work includes photography, performance, choreography, video, sound, sculpture, and installation. Her interdisciplinary practice is rooted in shifting definitions of landscape, character development, art, political and social histories, and the interconnectedness of formal processes. Kim is an artist, educator, writer, and independent curator based in Joshua Tree, California, whose creative practice is focused on the human-driven transformation of some of the American West's most iconic arid regions through multi-year, research-based projects, merging cultural geography, public practice, and experimental documentary into creative, socially engaged transmedia experiences. I now welcome César, who will tell us a bit about Desert X's history and what we can expect from the 2021 iteration.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having us. Before we start, I want to acknowledge the Cahuilla people, who are the traditional custodians of the land where Desert X takes place. We respect the Cahuilla culture and identity, which has been bound up for generations with the land upon which we live, learn, and create. I want to start by bringing in our artistic director, Neville Wakefield, and having a brief introduction to the exhibition Desert X. Desert X is a recurring large-scale public art exhibition that takes place in the Coachella Valley. This forthcoming edition will be the third one, and the exhibition grapples with histories of both land art, but also more broadly, the lives and experiences of desert communities, both locally in the Coachella Valley and abroad. And as we begin, before we talk about the edition in 2021, I'm going to ask the artistic director, Neville Wakefield, to come on and tell us a little bit about the inception and idea behind Desert X and the previous two editions of the show, so that those of you watching who aren't familiar with our exhibition or project can learn a little bit about what we do prior to diving into the conversation about our forthcoming edition. So Neville, if you can join us.
Thank you, César, and thanks everyone for being here. So I'll just give a sort of brief introduction to Desert X and how it aligns with my interests, which really come from land art, partly because my experience with the West, particularly the American West, really came and discovery of it came through land art. And I think this is the sort of legacy that in some ways Desert X grapples with. I think there are two basic principles that come out of it that I think we embrace. One is that it's land art traditionally was anti-institutional, by which I mean it took art outside of the institutions and sort of in some ways lowered the threshold of entry, which I think is what we tried to do here with a large-scale show that's free to the public. I think it was also anti-material in some ways, by which I mean not just that the works were hard to own, but they really prioritized experience over ownership. And I think that's both of those ideas have been very important to Desert X. As César says, we've had two editions. We invite artists to come to the Coachella Valley. The valley itself, the desert here, is really the subject of the exhibition. we like to think of it as being site-specific or site-responsive in a way that perhaps public art isn't. And by that distinction, I'd like to just say, we're trying to create a show where the place is really generative, where the place really gives rise to the artwork, and the artwork couldn't have happened in many ways under other conditions. And I think it takes place along many different sort of axes, multiple axes, but I think, there are two in particular, the vertical and the horizontal, if you want. And these play into the 2021 exhibition in a slightly different way, I think. The vertical axis being the temporal axis, and a lot of the discussions that César and I have been having and really build on what we've done before have been about the way that history is, sort of like geology in some ways, and the geology is so visible here. It's a layering and an accretion of materials, of stories, of narratives, and these kinds of things. So that becomes, looking at these sort of strata, these different strata that make up not just the physical landscape, but the social and historical landscape of the desert has been very important to us. It also has a horizontal axis, if you want, and as much as the desert is a place of great geological stillness, it's also a place of movement, and in many ways, in the sense that it's been cinematized, screened through the moving window of a car, which is how a lot of us see it, and consists of this empire of signs, of billboards, which have been part of the shows, which I think you'll probably see, a recurring part of the shows, which you'll probably see here. But which often announce sort of the dream of ownership or the nightmare of disenfranchisement. But I think what's interesting about the 2021 show as it's being constructed is that it's very much about the spaces in between.
Correct.
Spaces in between these stories, in between these different narratives, and the spaces in between, the land itself. And I think, Kim will talk a little bit about this, I hope, in terms of, how land has been parceled out, particularly in relationship to the Small Tract Act. But then we also have these other divisions that take place within the valley, of course, relating to the checkerboard, so-called checkerboard, which divides the land between the Agua Caliente band of Cahuilla Indians and the settler culture. And I think what we've been exploring is the nature of those liminal spaces and what happens not in these, as it were, in these parcels, whether they're of history or of land, but in the spaces in between them.
And I think Neville, when that is a nice segue to sort of talk a little bit about how 21 will be both similar and different in organization and approach through our collaboration, because it's also, I think there's some logistical components that are interesting in how we had to work through in organizing this exhibition. I think, when Neville and when Neville approached me about joining him as a co-curator on this project, I think one of the first conversations we had was almost a little bit about a little reflection on these very charged histories of land art as well. And considering that these histories of land art are also incredibly exclusionary, they're mostly driven and shaped by white, cis, straight men. And thinking about the way that these mythologies of the desert as a barren landscape, as an empty place, also reinforce particular forms of colonial violence and erasure that don't often acknowledge that the many communities that make up this desert terrain. So I think an interesting sort of approach about how we could negotiate both a really important history, more formal history of land art with this kind of social and with broader social and cultural issues became a starting point for this exhibition. And I think one of the, well, we cannot sort of share too many specifics because I would never imagine to rob you from the experience and from the magic of actually encountering these works when it's safe to do so. I do want to sort of say that one of the sort of big overarching ideas guiding this project is that the desert is both a place and an idea, but when we talk about a place, meaning really sort of the local and lived realities of desert communities and what that sort of entails. So in many ways, it's also challenging a bit these universal narratives about desert landscapes and the kind of story of the cultural maker creative that travels to the desert in search of inspiration, but rather almost look inward a bit and also think about these lesser known histories and stories. So while there isn't necessarily an overarching, like sort of full thematic framework for the show, there are shared threads that intersect at questions that look at the desert as a border region, that look at Black histories in the desert, and what is the history of Blackness in the desert locally and globally, that look at the desert as this queer space, but in particular, a queer space for communities of color and for trans communities. So the exhibition is attempting to create meaningful dialogues between the very local lived realities of the Coachella Valley and broader global narratives that are shared by other people who live in communities like this elsewhere. And I think that's sort of, and we also organized this show during a pandemic. And I'll forefront this because I know it's a question that's been coming up a lot and lingering, that while it is not a show about the pandemic, it is a show that inevitably was shaped in many ways by these conditions. And that meant finding different ways of working, finding different approaches, and really getting, despite the challenges, an opportunity to reimagine what it's going to mean to hold space together, to share with art, to experience an exhibition once again. And so while we ask artists to look at their present, we also ask them to help us guide us to a future that we hope will come sooner than later. And with that, I think we'll invite Kim Stringfellow and Xaviera Simmons to join us, and we'll get our conversation started about some of the ideas they've been working through in the realization of their projects for Desert X.
Should I start with Kim, because I would love to hear about, obviously you're a resident not so much of the low desert but of the high desert, and have done created such an amazing body of work and research around that and particularly around the history of land. And funny enough, when we've been talking about land art, we tend to talk more about the art than the land. So it's immensely refreshing that your work is really looking at the nature and experience of that land, and particularly the way that it's been regulated.
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me to Expo Chicago and being part of this conversation. It's a very exciting one, and of course, close to me. Yeah, so for people that aren't really familiar with what I do these long-term research projects, and I've been primarily focused on the arid regions of the American Southwest, and in California in particular. I live in Joshua Tree, California. This is where I'm based, and I've been spending the past 20 years documenting through photography and writing and audio, other forms of media, these particular landscapes and the complexity of these particular landscapes. So starting with the Salton Sea, which is south of the Coachella Valley. And then I worked on a project called Jackrabbit Homestead, which is a project that investigated the Small Tract Act of 1938, which was a baby homestead act that allowed US citizens to lease out 5 acres of land. And if they proved it up by building a small structure, they were able to get that land for very little money. And a lot of people in the Los Angeles area actually participated. And we have these little cabins, the detritus of this movement that essentially kind of litter in a good way the desert. And so I was documenting those in a very Ed Ruscha type of way, the cabins themselves, but also delved into the history. And when I did so, I realized that they were being re-envisioned by a lot of artists and creative people because they're affordable, and also because the landscape is very beautiful. So that became part of the project as well. You know, artists like Andrea Zattel, an architect, Stephanie Smith, all sorts of people. Now I've been working for the last 5 years on the Mojave Project, which is an extension of these projects. And, you know, I'm working across 4 states. So all of those projects are available online. I use the web as a platform to distribute my work publicly. So specific questions? Anyone else jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I just like to talk a little bit about the 1938 Act and how it transformed the desert in that period, and what the legacy of it. I mean, we obviously the vernacular, the architectural vernacular of the Jackrabbit Homestead is the most visible aspect of it. But could you talk about the less visible aspects of it?
Well, the settlement pattern of small tracts can be seen readily on the landscape of the Morongo Basin area, which encompasses Joshua Tree National Park, Yucca Valley, Joshua Tree, 29 Palms, Winder Valley area. So, you know, there is a kind of desert sprawl out here that was engendered by the Small Tract Act, because all of these cabins were on 5 acres. So you have a singular cabin, which actually is quite sustainable in an arid landscape, you know, because it's a very small structure. And, but, you know, it spread people throughout this area. I, you know, like to say that, of course, these lands were long occupied by the indigenous people of the area. So up in this area, the Cahuilla were in this area, but it was primarily Chemehuevi territory, Serrano. So the Serranos and the Chemehuevi shared the oasis Amara in 29 Palms. And of course, those lands were taken away from them, you know, the oasis itself. There's some incidents that happened at the turn of the century where, you know, the individuals left, and now that land is actually where the National Park headquarters is, and also the 29 Palms Inn. So this area has been long occupied, long documented in oral histories, in salt songs, bird songs of the various Native people that are here. It's one thing that I didn't really discuss in very much detail that I'm very interested in now. You know, I'm interested in the fact that I'm working in an area down in Palm Desert that's called Cahuilla Hills. And, you know, the federal government took a section of land, and a section is a square mile of land that would be divvied up into 5 acres. And they disposed of it. That was the word they used. They disposed of land. This is land that they think is not valuable. What's interesting is some of that land that they disposed of is very close to a very expensive golf community. So, you know, there's a lot of aspects to this I think are really fascinating, but that is one thing that I really want to kind of discuss is, you know, the federal government making the decision without consultation of the people whose traditional lands these were in the first place. And that is something that we need to also consider, you know, thinking about small tracts. There is a beautiful romance of these people being able to go out into the desert and be able to occupy, and some wonderful things like the architecture, you know, the use of those structures now is very popular with contemporary architects. You see the shed roof used in structures. And, you know, I think it's interesting how it's made its imprint, you know, today on architecture, design, a lot of different things. But I think there's underlying histories that we also need to consider with this Baby Homestead Act.
And for our viewers who maybe aren't as familiar with this particular region or history, if Kim, maybe you can share with us, like sort of what was the impetus for this act? Who was it,
Mhm.
like who it benefited? Because I think
Yeah,
those specifics lay out some of these kind of underlying stories that
yeah.
help us connect this to a kind of broader Western expansionist history in the United States and its local implications. But for those who aren't as familiar, maybe tell us a little bit about the act and like who benefited from it, who was eligible for it, what were
Yeah.
some of the defining acts, so that maybe we can contextualize some of these conversations.
Okay, so the Small Tract Act, it was 1938. So you had a General Land Office director, Paul Whitmer, that came out to the high desert. Joshua Tree area is known as the high desert, because he heard a rumor that there were a lot of veterans that were applying for the Homestead Act of 1862 to get 160 acres as script for their service. And when he came out here, a lot of them were recovering from respiratory illnesses and things like that, you know, mustard gas from World War I. And he realized, like, people don't really need 160 acres because they can't really do agriculture and the things you traditionally did on that land. So they devised this idea of these 5-acre small tracts. And the term was to prove up by making, growing, ranching. And so instead, what they said is you can build a small structure. And if you do that, then you will be able to get a patent, which is the form of a deed from the US federal government. Once you acquired the land, it was yours. So you could sell it, you could pass it on to your kids, hold on to it, whatever. So it became very popular because there was one of the main boosters was Desert Magazine, which operated from early in the 1930s until 1958 under the main founder. And they were the booster of this. They were telling people constantly, here's how you can get your small tract. So a lot of people got into and they decided to apply. And many people were working class. They didn't own maybe property. And so this was a way for them to own a piece of the American dream. This
Mostly
idea.
mostly white, Kim, or who
Yes,
was
yes.
eligible?
I would say that, I kind of think of this as a white entitlement because I've looked through, those the ownership. There's a database in the Bureau of Land Management where you can look back and see the deeds, and I can look at the surnames and I can have some ideas. I would like to know if there's people that had come out, was there African American small tract homesteaders? I would like to know that, but I haven't found that information. And we know why maybe they didn't participate because of, in Mojave Project, I was doing work on the Palmdale, Lancaster area. And, there were active areas throughout the desert, throughout the country that were redlined. They were areas where Black people were not asked to come to be part of the community. And that since changed there, which is fortunate. It's a very diverse community out there. But, we can understand why this may not have happened with people. So that's another issue that I really would like to think about too, is who did this benefit? It was mid-century. I think it benefited mostly white people, white folks, so.
Yeah, and I think that definitely has implications in terms of thinking about what are sort of some interesting sort of counter histories to how we've built in many ways the sort of mythologies of the desert landscape and the architectural influences, right? And I think this is interesting to kind of bring Xaviera in here because I want to hear a little bit about where your headspace has been in developing this project, because we've had some fascinating conversations about both like histories of like whiteness in relationship to the desert landscape, and then where sort of Black narratives and stories fit in and imagery fits into this imaginary. So maybe tell us a little bit about where your ideas are right now, and where you, without sharing too much on your project, about as you've been working on, to develop this for Desert X?
It's so nice to see everyone, and thank you, Kim, for explaining so beautifully all of the things that you've been working through. It's inspiring. I will say, just to add to Kim's narrative and her work, that I'm going to read something. To understand the quest for reparations for African Americans who descend from slavery in California, supporters say it's necessary to take a hard look at the prevalence of slavery in the early days of the Free State. California joined the Union as a non-slavery state in 1850, but its reputation as a melting pot where racism dissolved in the fields of the gold rush was a folklore that masks a grim reality. Hundreds of enslaved people were already living in the state at the time of its admission, forced to work in mines and on plantations. So, the United States, I say this very often, the United States actually has kept much better history than much better records than it claims to, than we realize. We understand that, we understand the construction of this country. We understand the basic tenets of the trifecta of whiteness, coming from the British Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the Dutch Empire, countries. And we understand that quest to take over the whole entire space, and also push out the people who were here and take over Mexico and all of the parts of Mexico and all of this. So we understand that, and I think it's something that has to be a steady beat that we continue to remind ourselves as we walk the lands here and interpret and talk about the narrative. Inside the desert, it could be in the South, it could be in the North. For me, Malcolm X said something really beautiful. He said, south of Canada is the South. For me, the entire United States is a representation of the South. So whatever happened in the cotton fields happened in California. It happened in Oregon, where Black people were were banned. In California, they were basically banned. So wherever you go in the United States, you're basically reckoning with the foundation of the country, and to this day, and all the other narratives that come. So in a crazy way, to be an artist working in this way is to have a playground. There's so much to navigate and reconcile with. And then I'm a contemporary modern human being, right? I'm a person who, I can talk to, Neville and I've had many, I don't want to give it away, but we've had some really beautiful conversations about materials. I'll say it like that, and then César and I have had other conversations about communities and how they are reflected. And for me, it's been really exciting because I do feel as an artist a sense of, I know that I can play. I know that I have the ability to take all of this history, which is horrific. I mean, the construction of whiteness and all that has ensued is horrific. And when you really look at it, when you think about the day-by-day trajectory of that horror, and you hold that, but then there's also this understanding the narratives and the disenfranchisement, but then also understanding that there's so many stories that haven't been told or teased out. There's so many narratives inside of the desert, inside of the South, inside of the East that haven't really been, been reconciled. And so for me, I've been having a wonderful time both understanding the history, reconciling with the history, and also finding joy within the making of things. And I think that that's something that I kind of constantly have to do, because I understand the facts, or the data and statistics of the country. So I have to find ways to enjoy the material conversation that is also a part of it.
And getting into the kind of specificities of the Coachella Valley, we've had some big idea conversations around what is guiding or shaping the work that you're making for this exhibition. And we had a pretty fascinating conversation around this construction of whiteness and its manifestation in certain aspects of desert culture and pop culture that become sort of very identifiable. Can you tell us a little bit about this idea of the desert as sort of a space for the construction of imagery of a white imaginary?
Yeah, I really love the idea that, especially when you think of California and the desert and European contact with it, and then all of the people who come. I think, it's in American culture, it's so obvious, right? It's like, this is our most romantic landscape. This is our, like, kind of almost like shining star in a way of like the possibilities of developing the self as a human being, especially as it relates to whiteness, as it relates to white men and white men's ability to actualize themselves. But what's happened, and I don't want to give too much away, but I will say what has happened is that you have white culture building itself, and then you have other cultures who are coming after or who have lived here for generations but haven't been able to engage in the culture in the same way, now coming in and being fascinated by many aspects of this kind of like early modern period, mid-century modern period, post-civil rights period. You have people coming fascinated and looking up to the pioneers of these different periods in American culture and in American desert culture. Like we spoke about, you have lots of Chicanx communities who are embracing certain aspects of the culture that really point to, I hate to put it this way, I mean,
no, don't go.
Say what'd you say? No, I mean, I'm just saying, like, embracing this very white male aggressive kind of personality and being enthralled and I don't want to give it away, so I have to clip my language as I'm talking, but I remember a point in my own personal life where I was very enthralled with certain aspects of this kind of pioneering 1960s, 1970s white male figure. And you think about the land artists that we all know and love. And you think about, popular culture and how that manifested inside of the desert. And there's a fascination with becoming American and becoming a free American. And I think the desert represents free America, a real like contemporary version of a free America, which, when you are not a free American in the same way, there's some kind of, I can't even, you guys got me like having to like not say
anything. Don't no.
Because the language, because let me just say, because I work with language, right? I can't use the language that I want to use, because if I use the language that I want to use, I will actually be describing the work.
Yeah.
Sarah, can I ask you a very banal question, but one that I haven't yet asked you, which is about your and actually the same for Kim, about your first experience of the desert.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a really beautiful question. I love that question. I've got to. I can't even. I feel like I've always experienced the desert. What I mean by that is that it's always been in my imagination. And I think just very personally, like my mother would go, I lived in New York, but my mother would go to California, like when I was very, very little, and come back with stories, because she was much more like hippie, Black woman, alternative person. And so I have this kind of fantasy of it. And so I can't remember where the fantasy hits into my reality, but I know I have an experience of, I can't even say when that happened.
And Kim?
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. Well, I'll give a more literal. As a child, we did road trips throughout the American Southwest. So a lot of it was in a car, looking framed by that space of, these windows, but, and, kind of half asleep, woken up, stars, land moving, the blur. And then later on, when I was around, I guess around 10 or so, I used to spend summers in Carson City, Nevada, which is just south of Reno, and that's the Great Basin. It's another type of desert. And I think that's where I really developed my love, because I'm an only child. I had to entertain myself. So I just would walk and hike out in the land. So it definitely imprinted me.
Neville, I want to hear your first desert experience, because I think there's an interesting sort of relationship that we have with both like the desert as a physical place, and then Xaviera, like you said, the desert as a kind of sort of almost emotional landscape, personal landscape that we think about as sort of an idea more so. What is your first desert experience?
My first desert experience was actually out here in Southern California. Coming from Europe, but I grew up in some very small islands, a long way offshore, and relatively remote. And I think the resonance for me was about island life. It was about living in a place where you're almost defined by horizon, or at least your curiosity is always drawn by horizon. So when I first came here and kind of found myself sort of relatively isolated in this expanse, it actually felt incredibly familiar.
Mm-hmm.
I think as a state of mind, whether it's physical or ontological speculation, this idea of horizon is very important to me, and is a critical part of my experience of both the ocean and the desert.
I think when we had early conversations about joining this project, that my team at the organization I run in Los Angeles sort of like jokingly and I like sort of laughed and said, you like in boots out in the desert looking for sites. I don't think they sort of imagined that section, but I think it's also largely my own relationship to this place, because the desert for me has always been merely a space of transit. So I was raised in a small border town in Mexico called Mexicali, which is actually a border town that you sort of that's in rather at the very sort of southern edge of the desert region. And I have family in the desert, and but when my family migrated to the U.S., that sort of space between that border point and Los Angeles, for me, almost just became a space of migration that I blocked off for a long time. It wasn't a space that necessarily I thought about in terms of a destination, a space I wanted to go back to, or when my parents would do trips to visit aunts and uncles in India and in Coachella, they I hated doing that. It had these memories of like, this is just sort of the location between a home that we left and then a home we have now. So the desert for me, and I think for a lot of immigrants who've had to sort of traverse a desert, right? That sort of space doesn't necessarily easily come to us as a destination, as a place we're meant to reside in, to live in, to have life experiences in. It's very much a space that gets us from one place to the other. I think for me, the biggest sort of shock and I think gift of the experience of organizing this show is being able to spend a significant amount of time there, that almost really debunks this notion that the desert is sort of really thought of as a desolate place. And when we were sort of talking about what we wanted the ideas to be that were going to guide how we were going to work with all of you and with artists, and thinking about the show, it was very much thinking also about the kind of mundane specificities, the day-to-day rhythms. I think that time operates differently in the desert. There's a multiplicity of rhythms at play, right? It's a tourist space at once, right? Like there's people that like come in for their, there's the snowbirds that come to spend a season, and then there's moments where the population expands and then it decreases. And then you also talk to, the folks who are working at hotels, who are cleaning your rooms when you travel, and you hear about where they live, and you start to understand that there's almost like multiple narratives that are incredibly contradicting. And then when you do the drive from beginning to sort of end, you see that manifested physically, from the tall walls and the golf courses to the kind of working class communities and restaurants and other places. So I think for me, that really sharp dichotomy between these myths of this desert as this kind of otherworldly place, and then the kind of like kind of quotidianness of the people who actually reside there. And I think for Kim and Xaviera, both of the ideas revolving around your projects, I think reveal some of these real, or some of these sort of less spoken or maybe misunderstood histories. So I wanted to sort of ask, how does the public nature of Desert X21 give artists new opportunities to unearth these histories or to explore them, or in your case, Kim, because you live here, to look at them anew?
Well, yeah, and I really appreciate, and I didn't know your history coming from Mexicali, and, thinking about, you're talking about the desert as a transit. I'm thinking about the corridor between Mexicali and El Centro, of people having to literally cross that border, binational workers who are, coming across to work, and how treacherous that is, and how much more treacherous it is now because of the past administration. And so there's so many different layers of people that are moving, the different types of transit, which are for necessity, for relaxation. You're a tourist, we're all moving through the space, and, taking it in a different way. So I think that was an interesting point. But, I'm attracted. I am an environmental activist. I'm interested in environmental justice and issues, and I'm constantly relearning. I think for me, I'm always learning new stories, and, it's helping me to reinterpret history and then share that with people. And so it's really important to be part of a program that allows that. So I'm happy that, I'm able to revisit this earlier project, which I did over 10 years ago, and then also have the space to think about it in different ways. Like I alluded to earlier, there's other things I can kind of think about that I didn't initially, and talk about those, or bring that to the attention of the audience. And so that's kind of what I'm interested in now, because it's never fun to just rehash something. It has to be fresh again,
And I have to agree. I'm very excited about the work that I'm making right now. And I think, obviously working with, you all, Neville, I've known for a really long time, and César, we're just getting to know each other. But I think, it's really I feel like I'm understanding, especially Neville, but, understanding certain aspects of similarities. Like and I'm going to say this because I actually, in a way, could be a Neville. Like, I can't wait to show this work. And what I mean by that is, I think when in art practices, oftentimes we get siloed in whatever way, you know what I mean? You get siloed by yourself because you're thinking about certain things. Like I hit really hard when I talk about American history, when I talk about reparations, when I talk about the construction of whiteness, when I talk about, land rights and all these kinds of things. And what I'm really excited about is to show my work in a public space, but to show another vision of the work that I don't think has ever been seen before. Another conversation, another way to look at how an American is constructed and how we are indoctrinated into a culture based on the myths and the myth makers that shape how we view ourselves, and then how we kind of have conversations or relate to each other. So in this way, I'm almost thinking of like I'm not going to say, I'm going to hold it, but I'm just, it's really exciting to be able to present this different side of my practice and another type of narrative inside of the practice in a public space.
I think we're gonna get ready soon to take any questions, but before we do that, just like Neville asked a question about your experiences in the desert, I want to ask, I want to kind of maybe, without sharing too much, because we've all been briefed 127,000 times about this before this talk. I want to talk a little bit about the conditions in which this exhibition is going to be experienced, because you know, we had to, I said, it's not a show about a pandemic, but it is definitely inevitably shaped by the reality in which we're in. And I think that there's been some incredible hopeful moments in this process. And I think that we've also been simultaneously we've been gifted the opportunity to work with artists who I firmly believe, and I think Neville and I, this will maybe connect some of our work, share that it's the work that you all do that really provides glimpses into possible ways of being and knowing in the world. And I think sort of driven by that and shaping the exhibition, at the same time, we're sort of reading every day. When you open up your like CNN page, it's like a splatter of red and everything is breaking news these days. And there was a moment of incredible intensity that I don't necessarily think is over. And I think, you know, we're living through a very particularly difficult time. And we're also working in a place, I think, that just geographically is about like extreme like weather, or like there's been these things about like barren landscapes. How over the past, you know, year that we've been working on this, where have you found some hope as you've been working on this project? There's been so much conversations about responding to sickness, responding to these statistics, but at some point, where is the joy and the hope in your work too? Because we're gonna need that after this moment. And I think a lot of us are looking to you as artists to help us take us to that space.
I have to be honest and say that I don't really like to use that type of terminology. I don't want to be, for lack of a better word, a hope peddler. Like I think the hope for me is that, you know, the United States will really look at itself and really digest that, what it is, and like really understand the history as much as individuals can and really start to make repairs. My hope comes from thinking about my work providing a spark of information actually and inspiration for people to start to, like, you know, people who don't even know the history, who don't know the history of what Kim's talking about, to like get that spark and to start doing the research and then to really reconcile with what we have going on here. It was just 3 weeks ago that the Capitol was stormed, and now yesterday we have an election, a president-elect who's already saying, let's talk about hope. And for me, I'm not ready for hope. I'm like, I still have to reconcile the fact that we're in a civil war. And so for me, my hope is that people will look at the work that we present and be really inspired to do more research into what the landscape, what happened inside of the landscape, and what they would like to see change about the nature of the world and the country that we're living in. And so that's where I get the hope, is from the spark of change that I know art can do.
Yeah, that was really beautiful. I think that, you know, for me, artists, the best artists activate and instigate and facilitate conversation. I think that's what our gift is. And so however we choose to use that. And so, yeah, I mean, this has been such a complicated, complex year. And, you know, I think sometimes things have to break, they have to move forward. So I try to look at things that have been happening in ways of like, okay, so how can we move beyond this and learn from these situations? And so, you know, maybe I have a sense of hope, but, you know, there's also a sense of despair with climate change, race in this country, which has been so prevalent, but so like pushed to the side, so that these conversations are front and center is a beautiful thing. So, we have to continue with that. But yeah, I was kind of looking at the chat to see if there's things that we should maybe discuss. So do you guys want to?
Yeah, I think we have time for about one question. And then I want to. Someone asked for a teaser, but the question was worded so well that I think we have to respond to it. I think there was a question that says, you talk about the desert inspiring work, but how does the desert limit it as well? So maybe this is a question. Yeah, I'd love to hear what Xaviera and Kim, what you have to say about that as you've been working on your projects.
No. Oh, you go ahead, Kim.
No, you go ahead.
My work is not happening. Well, it's shown in the desert, but it's not, I'm not producing it on site in the desert, but I have produced many works on site in the desert, actually. And it's so expansive, actually. I don't know that it limits. It doesn't actually, because the space is more expansive, especially coming from New York, right, where I live. It's like the space itself lends itself to almost having, I don't know, there's so many visual goodies, I want to say, inside of that landscape. So for me, it doesn't limit the work at all.
And Kim?
Yeah. Well, I think I like the idea of more learning from the landscape and working with the landscape rather than, taking something and putting it there and using it as a backdrop. That's something that I've always been against, this idea. It makes a lovely photograph and most objects will benefit from that. But I think we have to go deeper than that. And, if I'm asked to do a site-specific commission, it's going to be site specific, so I'm going to delve into the history of that particular place and do that. But in terms of limits, I think sometimes, there are places, wild places, places that are sacred landscapes for people that perhaps we should not be citing works. For instance, this thing that we all saw in the New York Times of that monolith and all the problems that go with something like that. There's things like that we have to consider, and that kind of harkens back to land arts, land art movement, and thinking about Heiser and the different people that were involved in that, and how we can move forward from those strategies, which people have done over the past 40 years, definitely. So
can I ask one question inside of this, Kim? Do we have time? Well, I just want to understand, I guess, from I don't know how long your family's been here and how long but it feels sometimes like people are very pick and choose when they're gonna be reverential to specific sites, because I think what I mean to say is that the land itself is considered sacred across the whole entirety. Yeah. So now all of a sudden people, and particularly white people, are like, well, this is sacred here, so don't, but then here, like, I respect this portion of the land that's, but then I'm gonna just run ramshot all over the place over here. Like, I'm trying to understand how that works, because it's all sacred at the end of the day, especially from a First Nations perspective. So if I was a First Nations person, maybe I would come to your home and say, well, but your home is on sacred land, so can you please move that?
Yeah. And that has, there was actually with the Oasis Amara, in the 70s, it was Chumwavy, they actually came and asked for the inn to cede those lands back to them. That did not happen, but I know that the current owners who've been longtime desert dwellers, they acknowledge those histories, and that's part of that. That doesn't compensate at all. You know, so yeah, there's so many issues. And I think also, you know, I think a lot about capital and the overlays of property ownership, especially with a small tract, and just this idea that we can even own a piece of land, which in many ways, even though I am a homeowner, is quite absurd. You know, I feel like I'm more of, you know, like a caretaker of a particular place. So, you know, those are things that I work within that, because like, oh, you know, I pay taxes, do this thing. I'm, you know, accepting it passively, but at the same time, I kind of want to rail against it too, you know? So I think, you know, thinking about how does, you know, a particular piece of land, like this idea that the desert is barren, you know, or lifeless, or an empty space. Those are the types of things that I'm trying to create dialogue to inform and educate people. No, this is not the case. And there's many layers of occupation that are maybe invisible to you. And also finding out who those interlopers, who those people were, in making that, you know, present to think about that. So, you know, like I said, I facilitate. I'm trying to facilitate and bring people stories, and hopefully they can tell them themselves. But you know, it's a learning process for me too. And
I think we've sort of run out of time, and maybe we could do this sort of as a way to wrap. We got an inquiry that says we'd love to hear about specific visual, oral, musical, textual, cultural references for the Desert X 21 projects, a teaser of what we can expect. So maybe Xaviera, Kim, if you want to share maybe some references, and then Neville, I think you and I can maybe share a few, and we'll wrap up there. Who wants to go first?
I cannot share this aspect of the work, to be real honest.
Yeah.
I will say that silver has become a material that I did not work with previously, that I have found so much joy working with while I've been working on this project.
Great teaser. Kim?
Oh, so without giving it away.
Yeah.
Well, years and years ago, I was more of a maker, and I have been more of a documentarian in really the past 20 years. Mm-hmm. So I would say that it's a real pleasure to be a maker right now. So, and I think I should just leave it at that and make it a surprise.
Neville, do you want to share any reference in your thinking?
I don't know whether I could share anything without letting the cat out of the bag, but what I would like to say in terms of sort of rounding this up is, you know, we started the conversation with the legacy of land art and these ideas of you know, center around white male pioneer figures, so called. And I think, you know, what we're tasked with in a way is reimagining what land art could be. And so I just want to thank you both, Kim and Xaviera, for being a part of that.
Yeah.
Thank you both for inviting us to be a part of it and to be a part of your vision.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I think that's sort of wraps up our time. Please visit desertx.org, join our mailing list if you're not on our mailing list yet, to stay updated. We very much look forward to welcoming you to the exhibition when it is safe for you to see it. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.